I'm here to talk about systems Aikido. So why do we need systems Aikido? Well, basically, many of the systems that we have to interact with for sustainability are complex adaptive systems. So that is systems of many interacting parts, some of which might be evolving or adaptive parts themselves. And these systems can give rise to unexpected, higher level behaviors. And when we're interacting with systems like this, we're not interacting with static artifacts. We're interacting with complex processes. And we need new approaches to deal with this. Because otherwise, we often get unexpected indirect effects when we just barge in and try to manipulate these systems. So, for example, putting iron filings into the ocean, we can end up with massive algal blooms, which damage marine ecosystems rather than sequestering carbon, which is what we're trying to do. Or in pushing policy-wise or economically for biofuels, we can get an unexpected rise in food prices. So these kind of biological complex systems have their own powerful dynamics, which we're often pushing against. And when we push against these sort of dynamics, we get energy inefficient systems. But this is actually how most of our technology currently works. So a classic example is the intensive arable agricultural system, in which every year we're plowing, we're digging, we're putting in fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, huge amounts of energy to make this system run. But what are we actually doing when we do that? Well, if you left that field to its own devices from bare earth, it would eventually be colonized by annual plants, weeds, then perennial plants, scrub, and ultimately trees. It would go through ecological succession. That's what the ground wants to do, if you like. And we're putting in energy to constantly bring the system back, to hold the system at the beginning of succession. And we do this because that creates the ideal condition for annual plants, for the plants that we use as our crops. But most of those crops were originally evolved from weeds. So we're actually creating the ideal conditions for weeds at the same time. Thus, we have to put in the fertilizers, the pesticides, and plow again every year. We're constantly creating a rod for our own back, reinforcing the need to do work. And basically, like Sisyphus, we're constantly pushing a rock up a hill, only to have it roll back down again. So I think this is basically like us doing karate on biological systems. So you can see this guy here, he's putting in a lot of effort, putting in a lot of energy and force against our opponents, our biological systems. And we should be thinking about doing Aikido. So in Aikido, you wait for your opponent to run at you. You use your opponent's momentum and strength against them. And then you just wait, and when they come towards you, you intelligently interact with them, tip them, cause them to fall. But it's their own momentum that actually causes them to fall. You're putting in much less effort. So we need methods for doing systems Aikido on biological systems. So what I try to think about is how to do Aikido on bacterial ecosystems. So these are just a few species of soil bacteria that I grew up just by putting a little tiny sample of soil from a park into a Petri dish. And you can see there's lots of different forms of bacteria there. But most bacteria in soil are actually unculturable. There may be up to 1 million species in a gram, and they're enmeshed in a complex interacting community, which we don't really know how to manage. Additionally, most bacteria are living in groups. They're living together in structures that they co-produce rather than individually, and they're evolving constantly. So like all bacterial systems, all biological systems, bacteria have an enormous capacity to evolve rapidly. And we've been pushing against this capacity for a very long time. So intensive antibiotic use is effectively doing karate on bacterial systems. What bacteria do best is evolve. So by using antibiotics, we've come up with very antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So what can we do about this? Well, cooperation is one of the most sort of significant properties of that bacteria possess. And we're going to try and use this as a lever, as a point of intervention to do Aikido on our communities by thinking about the context in which cooperation will or won't evolve and how we can interact with that. So we know that cooperation can be difficult. The classic example is looking at a community common grazing area. And if everyone in a group puts 2 sheep on this common grazing area, then it's maintained, it's a sustainable resource. But as an individual, if you put 3 sheep on that area, then you get all the benefit of having that extra sheep, and everyone in the group shares the cost of the resource being degraded by there being too many sheep on it. So what happens? Everyone cheats. Magical special effects there. The common is degraded, the resource is destroyed, and cooperation collapses. And that's what's called a tragedy of the commons. And this happens in biological systems too. There are lots of very well-known experiments which show, however, that cooperation can evolve in group contexts, for example, especially if these are imposed. So this is a famous experiment in which single chickens from battery cages were selected, the single most productive chickens selected. Ultimately, then you get a reduction in egg production because you're selecting the meanest chicken out of a group. That's why it's producing more eggs. If you select whole groups of chickens together for total egg production, then you select nice, happy, sociable groups, and egg production ultimately goes up. So we want to think about this kind of dynamic. We've already used this idea, imposing group structure and reproduction, on whole microbial ecosystems, on whole soil ecosystems. This is in Spain, looking at sort of degraded soil in arid conditions. And we can actually effectively evolve whole bacterial communities which support plant growth in these conditions. So without having to decide what each individual bacterium is doing, engineer it and put it there. But we're still having to evolve, to put in the effort, to put in this population structure and reproduction in that situation. So it's not entirely an Aikido approach. So what can we do? Well, what we're ultimately trying to progress towards is manipulating the context of evolution to favor cooperation or cheating within bacterial biofilms that we have here, so that they actually choose or they evolve towards a group structure themselves which favors or disfavors cooperation. We're trying to do this by changing the environmental conditions in which the bacterial colonies exist, changing resource levels which they're surrounded by, changing the level of public good which they have access to. And ultimately trying to get to a situation in what the bacteria want to do, what they want to evolve to, is what we want them to do, by changing the context in their environment. So there's lots of different approaches, lots of different ways you could do systems Aikido, but in terms of you're looking at evolutionary systems, I think they kind of boil down to something like this. At the top, we've got a situation, at A, we've got a system at high fitness at A, which is something that we don't want. So maybe it's bacteria causing disease or something like that. But that's their high fitness point. That's the top of a fitness landscape. And so they'll always evolve there. Situation B is something that we do want, bacteria not causing us any problems. So we change their environment, we change their context so that their fitness landscape changes, and the situation which we do want is the high fitness situation for them, and they evolve towards that. The situation that we don't want is a situation that's unstable for them. So all of this is ultimately inspired by a sustainable design system called permaculture, which some of you might have heard of, which is about constructing agricultural ecosystems. And one of the inventors of permaculture basically defined it as being a system of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor. And I think this is what we need for our technological solutions. So I would say that this philosophy of systems Aikido, although I do it on bacteria, I think this could apply to the management of any complex adaptive system. And it's a challenge that we really need to take up, to develop these Aikido approaches to managing systems. Because for years, since the Industrial Revolution, what we've done is put in massive amounts of energy and resources to do karate on complex adaptive systems. Oil has allowed us to do this. And as the world changes, what we need is Aikido. Thank you.